Today, I want to talk about a problem in tech that's both pervasive and ignored. That's discrimination against Asian Americans in the workplace, particularly the idea that they're not perceived as leaders. This is sometimes called the bamboo ceiling or the Asian glass ceiling. I'll also talk about people who are racial advocates in Silicon Valley often contribute to the problem by ignoring it or claiming that it's not a problem. And then finally, I'll list a few solutions for people who are interested in combating the problem of anti-Asian racism can do so. Let's start with who is Asian? The term Asian encompasses South Asians, such as people from India, East Asians, people from China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asian from countries such as Indonesia or Vietnam. As you can see, being Asian spans different races and different cultures. But one thing Asian Americans have in common, despite which kind of Asian they are, is that they're stereotyped as worker bees, essentially, capable of doing low-level work at the individual contributor level, but they're not seen as management material. Asians, as a group, are the least promoted of any other racial group. Graduates from Harvard and Stanford produced a study called Illusions of Success, and they looked at EEOC data from 2017. EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And they found that Asians were the least likely to be promoted to management of any race. Less likely than whites, but also less likely than Hispanics and Blacks. The same researchers looked at national EEOC data, and they found that what they saw in the Bay Area was replicated across the nation, that Asians, again, were the least likely of any race to be promoted into management and also into senior management positions. What I want to show you here is the ratio of workers to managers at Bay Area manufacturing and information companies. This chart goes through the ratio of workers to executives. And let's define terms. Here it shows professional versus executive. When they say professional, what they mean are workers or employees. And when they say executives, they're referring to up to 2 levels removed from the CEO. So the senior most managers at a company. What you can see in the top left is that whites have a plus 25% compared to the average in terms of holding executive positions versus worker positions. Asians have a negative 22%. This compares unfavorably not just to whites, but also Hispanics and Blacks. If we look at Hispanics, the ratio is, the number is negative 1.3%, and for Blacks, it's negative 0.8%. So again, the number for Asians is negative 22%. So the problem of being stereotyped and pigeonholed as individual contributors acutely affects Asians more so than any other race. Let me shift gears from data to anecdotes. I'm South Asian myself, and I have friends who are Asian who work in the tech sector. And here are some things I've heard. That they feel like they're reduced to a stereotype, that they're thought of like a robot or like a workhorse, essentially someone who will do the work without complaining, but they're not viewed holistically as a full person with feelings, with ambition, and consequently, they're treated in that way. They're given things to do, but management doesn't see a management path for them. Along the same lines are assumptions that management has of Asians in the workplace. Again, from my peers or from friends who are Asian, these are the things I've heard most common. One, not a leader, lacks soft skills, doesn't think strategically. What I find interesting about this is those people who said these things have some of the best soft skills I've seen, regardless of race. And from casual discussions that I've had with them, think strategically about the tech industry. And yet somehow management doesn't see that. One of the things I want to mention is prescriptive stereotypes. What those are essentially an individual prescribing how a person should act or how they must act. So, for example, if you see Asians as not thinking creatively, if there's, let's say, an Indian person on the team, you think that they're good at, let's say, math or writing code. If there's an opportunity for them to participate in, let's say, some new business that requires creativity, you might not even solicit their opinion because you don't think they're good at that necessarily. So that forces that person into a box where they're not able to show their skills because you've determined ahead of time they don't have that skill set. Or if there's an Asian woman on the team and someone has to work cross-functionally with different parts of the organization, that's often a stepping stone to management. But if you don't see that person as someone who can lead such an initiative, you might never ask her. And that's a way in which people's stereotypes essentially confine Asians to a certain way of being and don't explore characteristics that would lend themselves to management. So let's talk about some of the stumbling blocks to breaking the bamboo ceiling. The first hurdle is the model minority fallacy. In this fallacy, people assume Asians are doing well, they don't need help. The reality is, it doesn't matter how much education or how much income you have, that doesn't spare you from racism. Jewish Americans are a good example. As a group, they economically fare well, but that doesn't protect them from anti-Semitism. And so that's a serious concern, regardless of the, let's say, the average income of that group. The same is true with Asian Americans and the bamboo ceiling. The bamboo ceiling prevents people from self-actualizing, from going as far as their abilities take them because of racism. And so the model minority fallacy holds Asian progress back because people have these errant notions. The second is apex fallacy. So you might be familiar with some Asian CEOs such as Sundar Pichai of Google or Jensen Huang of NVIDIA. The apex fallacy basically means you evaluate a group, in this case Asian Americans, based on the performance of the best or most successful group members. As we saw earlier in the presentation, a lot of Asians are struggling at the bottom of the organization, and they're the least likely to be promoted. So these few examples shouldn't overshadow the experience of many Asian Americans. The third hurdle is comparing, which is to say that Group X is doing worse than Group Y, and therefore we shouldn't concern ourselves about Group Y. Martin Luther King said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The idea is that we all have a stake in one another's equality. So just because an organization fights for racial justice and fair treatment for Black Americans or for women in the workplace doesn't mean that we should exclude Asians from the pursuit of equality, nor should we practice racism against Asians and normalize it. Recently, a Silicon Valley company released a 19-page diversity report. In it, they said, quote, "If you do not intentionally include, you will unintentionally exclude." The irony is that the report talked about African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans, but excluded Asian Americans. This is one of the challenges today, is that human resources and diversity officers, the very people who are tasked to solve problems of racial fairness, often through conscious or unconscious bias, exclude Asian Americans from their efforts. This is an area that needs to be addressed. So we've talked about the problem. What's the answer? I've outlined two solutions to address anti-Asian bias in the workplace. The first is to include Asians in tech companies' diversity plans. As we just saw, tech companies often exclude Asians from those plans. So one thing that might be simple to do is if you see a tech company's diversity plan or them publishing their numbers, but excluding Asians from that, is to email HR or email the diversity officer and encourage them to include Asians in those efforts. The second is incorporate implicit bias training for employees. Different companies already have implicit bias training, for example, Google and Starbucks, but they too omit Asians from that training. Let me step back. Implicit bias is basically subconscious or unconscious bias. So the kinds of stereotypes we form about different kinds of people, sometimes not even being consciously aware we're doing it. Implicit bias training seeks to break those connections in our minds so that we treat people fairly. Starbucks recently had implicit bias training for all of its employees, and it addressed discrimination against Blacks and Hispanics, but not Asians. So whatever Starbucks employees, whatever their biases were before the training, they had those same biases after the training because no effort was undertaken to address Asian stereotypes. The Asian American community welcomes and needs allies. So if you're able to take action on either of these two solutions, that would be very much welcome and appreciated. We can't talk about ethics in tech without talking about racial fairness. People naturally want to go as far as their abilities take them, but unfortunately biases and stereotypes get in the way. People have no control over their skin tone, the shape of their eyes, or facial features. And ultimately, companies are better off when they promote based on merit rather than superficial qualities. I also want to close by saying this is less about management positions than it is the pain and humiliation people feel when they're rejected or they're not promoted because they don't look the part. The solutions that I mentioned, hopefully there are opportunities ahead that people can act on those and put a dent in the bamboo ceiling to reform tech and make it a place where everyone is treated fairly.